Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u specijalno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Prije skoro 500 godina protestantski svećenik i reformista Martin Luther školovao se i napisao neka od svojih najznačajnijih dijela upravo ovdje u Erfurtu u centralnoj Njemačkoj. Danas, kada se sve više govori o reformi Islama s ciljem borbe protiv ekstremizma i suočavanjem sa izazovima modernosti, brojni zapadni intelektualci, ali i političari, tragaju za muslimanskim Martinom Lutherom. Je li muslimanima potreban vlastiti Martin Luther ili ne? Treba li i može li se reformisati islam? Analiziramo u nastavku naše emisije. Ali prije toga, pogledajmo uvodni prilog.
Žene za upravljačima vozila na ulicama saudijskih gradova. Do sada nezamisliva scena u toj zemlji. Omogućeno im je to na osnovu odluke iz septembra prošle godine koja je donesena kraljevskim dekretom. Posljednji potezi vlasti dio su šire reformske agende koju provodi prijestolonasljednik Muhamed bin Salman.
Ovo izgleda potpuno drugačije nego na stražnjem sjedištu. Sretna sam, ne znam kuda bih gledala. Nisam navikla na ovo.
Zahtjevi za ukidanjem zabrane trajali su od 1990. godine uz povremene proteste u kojima su žene masovno vozile automobile u javnosti. Saudijske vlasti do sada su takve postupke žestoko kažnjavale pravdajući ih vjerskim razlozima. Kraljevina je od osnivanja važila za jednu od najkonzervativnijih arapskih i muslimanskih zemalja. Uspostavljena je kao nasljedna monarhija gdje je vladajuća dinastija Ali Saud imala političku, a konzervativna islamska struja vjersku vlast.
Oni koji ne žele da idemo naprijed nastavit će govoriti da je ovo suprotno vjeri i tradiciji. Islam nema veze s ovim, već se koristi samo kao izgovor.
Dolaskom Salmanovog sina Muhameda na poziciju nasljednika saudijske krune vidljivi su prvi znaci društvenih promjena. 30-godišnji princ u prvi plan je stavio društvene potrebe mlade generacije. Ublažena su stroga pravila koja nisu dozvoljavala miješanje muškaraca i žena. Održavaju se muzički koncerti, otvaraju kino dvorane, a na tribinama nogometnih stadiona muškarcima su se pridružile i žene. Promjene su vidljive i na vanjskom planu. Najznačajnije su prekid bezrezervne podrške palestinskom pitanju, intervencija u Jemenu i nastavak potpune blokade do jučerašnjeg zaljevskog saveznika Katara. Organizacije za ljudska prava upozoravaju da društvene promjene u Saudijskoj Arabiji ne prate i slobode ljudskih prava. I dalje se žestoko kažnjava svako protivljenje zvaničnoj politici.
O muslimanskim reformističkim pokretima koji su počeli krajem 19. i početkom 20. stoljeća pojašnjava nam Jamal Malik, profesor na Univerzitetu u Erfurtu. Professor Jamal Malik, hello and welcome to Jazeera Balkans. Now, how would you explain the rise of Islamic revivalist and reform movements at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century?
Okay, you're referring to nowadays called political Islam or Islamism or fundamentalism, something like that, no? 1920s, in between the wars, right? A couple of people, urban, who were somehow connected to the colonial setup, came up with the idea to, come up with a new sort of Islam, which they called Salafi Islam, political Islam, something like that. And the background, of course, was the appalling situation in which the Muslims were. That was the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. That was finally the abolition of the Caliphate. And, of course, a deep colonialism, in fact. And these new social formations who actually were produced in the colonial system themselves, like, new intellectuals, like journalists, like lawyers, people like that, they got together and started to develop an idea that we should mend the situation, right? We should come up with some sort of a reform or a revival, in the sense that we have to kind of bring in the pristine glory of Islam again. In order to do that, of course, these new social formations, they actually adopted and adapted, ideas of the colonial system and made them part of their biography, right? Like, Shura, like Hizb, all these notions. They kind of integrated them into some sort of Islamic semantics, okay? And with this, they were able to mobilize quite a number of people, although these political Islamists, they didn't have the mass basis like the ulama had. The ulama, they had the huge followers, they had numbers of followers through the khutbah, through their network, the madrasa network and the shrines. And these intellectuals, they didn't have that, right? So in order to develop some sort of a mass base among the urban groups, they had to develop a new strategy. And one of the strategy was, of course, da'wah, which is Islamic mission, as you were. And of course, the methods they had learned from the Christian missionaries who were out there in the Muslim world. So insofar, they used da'wah in order to develop a very specific piety, a Muslim piety, right? The Muslim individual who apparently, according to themselves, had lost the Islamic path, right, had to be re-Islamized. And the re-Islamization of the ordinary Muslim was only possible through sunnaticizing the life world, which is imitatio Muhammadi, following the sunnah of the Prophet.
But how was their approach towards reforming and reviving Islam different from the approach of earlier Islamic scholars?
Right.
And earlier reformists, there were many in the past.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So in the pre-modern period, of course, it was the Tajdeed or the Mujaddid, who was the man who would come and revive. And then we have, in the 18th century, we have also Sufis who come up with some sort of a reform. Neo-Sufism, we call it, in the 18th century. In the 19th century, you have again new, different players who are part or somehow run over by the colonial rule in the 19th century, called the Salafiyya, Jamal al-Afghani and so on. So these are all indeed people who try to come up with some idea of reform and revival. But the thing is, here by the 1920s and 30s, we have new social formations who focus also on very specific groups, urban groups. It's an elitist approach, actually, in that 1920s and 30s. And of course, the difference is they're highly colonialized, right? Their sort of Islam is an urban Islam which tries to compete with the colonial rule on the one hand, and also to distinguish itself from the Islamic tradition, yeah, from the traditional scholarship. Insofar, it's totally different.
What is the difference between reform and revival in Islam?
I don't think that is easy to kind of distinguish. Both concepts do reciprocate in a way. You see, in the pre-modern area, you have the mujaddid idea. That would be something like, you know, tajdeed and islah, to reform something. The other one would be the revival, which would start, say, with maybe 18th century Abdul Wahhab, that try to bring out certain practices and certain ideas only. Focus on that, you know, like, you know, bid'ah, not to follow the bid'ah, for instance, only to follow the Quran and certain traditions like the Muwatta, which was so important for Abdul Wahhab and you know, these revivalists. So I think in the context of reform, if we talk of tajdeed, there's more of a creativity, while revival could be reduced to, you know, going back to the sources only.
Now, what sparked the 1970s Islamic revival? Was it the failure of Pan-Arabism and the advent of Salafism, or was it the 1967 fiasco between Arab states and Israel, or?
Yeah, I think that's a very complicated scenario, and I wouldn't kind of reduce it to the Islamic, you know, pantheon. It's a global phenomena in the 1970s that religion basically comes back. Scholars talk about the return of the gods, or the privatization of religion and so on. So that's a global phenomena, and it might have to do with, you know, the processes of globalization, where we see, you know, some sort of a religious resistance articulated among different scholars and activists, who then land up in revivalist movements. And in the so it's a global phenomena. You find these movements among the Christians or the Hindus, and so on and so on.
So it wasn't specific to Islam anyway.
Yes. What is specific to Islamic? Of course, you also already mentioned that the war, you know, which no 60, what was that? 67, which was considered to be a wrath of God, right? Then we have the war that followed, Yom Kippur war, which was not, as far as I remember, was not fought in the name of Pan-Arabism, but, you know, in the name of Islam. So this showed some kind of a change, that people thought, yes, Pan-Arabism didn't work actually.
So let's try something new.
Yes, absolutely. This is one. Then, of course, you have the energy crisis, which produced the OPEC, you know, this organization, and therefore, and with that connected, it produced high expectations among the people, you know, in terms of modernization, in terms of development, and so on. But it didn't work, actually. It didn't work. The elite politicians, the rulers, authoritarian, secular rulers, they were not concerned with this issue. The people, the problems and the predicaments of the people. And this, of course, produced new resentments among large groups of, people. And then finally, this whole resentment got a ventil through this Iranian revolution. The Iranian revolution, although it was a Shia revolution with an Ayatollah, heading it, but nevertheless, it became extremely important even for the Sunnis in mobilizing. Yes, there's something. We can use Islam properly.
Right, Professor Jamal Malik, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Okay.
Šta je zapravo salafizam? Ko su selefije i zbog čega se u medijima povezuju sa radikalizmom? Razgovaramo sa Misbahur Rehmanom, profesorom na Univerzitetu u Frankfurtu. Now, Professor Rehman, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera Balkans. Now, would you say that Salafism is a byproduct of Islamic revival, and why so?
Well, Salafism definitely is the byproduct of the Islamic revival because it's part of the same current that we see in the 18th and 19th century. There are different modernist movements are emerging in this time, in this specific time. Before this, we do not find any such movements that would describe itself as a Salafi movement. This is the first time that we see it in the end of 19th century, actually.
What sparked these movements at the end of the 19th century?
Well, it was the challenges of the time, and the new challenges, the new thoughts that were coming from different parts of the world, specifically from the West, because the Muslim world was being colonized. And when you are being colonized, your thoughts are being colonized. I mean, different thoughts come up, and those thoughts are much more assertive or much more authoritative in the minds of many people. So you have to answer those thoughts. You have to tackle those thoughts. And for that, you need to get rid of the baggage that you have before. You need to reinterpret the texts. So what these movements normally do is they first of all deny the early authorities, which is the traditional authorities. For example, they just deny taqleed, or the followings of, let's say, the 4 law schools, which were the traditional law schools, because these law schools have interpreted the texts. But this interpretation is, of course, is a very rigid interpretation which was done in a specific time. In the 18th, 19th century, when these new challenges came in, this interpretation was not really working. So they got rid of those interpretations, and then they started their own interpretations in the face of the modernity. And that's why these movements are also called modernist movements, which started in 18th and 19th century. Salafism is also part of this exact movement. I mean, Salafism is, of course, there are different factions of it, but generally speaking, it's also a modernist movement started in 18th and 19th century.
Mm-hmm. Now, has the term Salafism been hijacked by radical extremists, and why is it to such an extent associated with radicalism today?
Well, I wouldn't call it hijacked because there is no authority that could monopolize the understanding of a specific term in Islam. In Islam, anyone can interpret anything as they wish. So, but I do consider it a bit paradoxical to call themselves Salafis, because by their own admission, they are very, they are in a way least tolerant towards the understandings of early scholars. For example, they would not follow the 4 law schools. So in that sense, they are kind of denying the interpretations and the understandings of early scholars. So to call themselves Salafis is in a way paradoxical. You call yourself Salafis, but you deny the understandings of early Salafis. On the other hand, those people which are called traditionalists, they are the ones normally who adhere to following the understandings of the Salafs. So I do call it paradoxical, but hijacking would be not be suitable in an Islamic setup, because there is no specific understanding of a specific term that we could say that this is the real meaning, and now another person who is using in another meaning is wrong. So
Yeah, what sparked the 1970s massive Salafi movement around the world? Was it primarily initiated by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states?
Well, if we consider the Hanbalis as Salafis, then of course it goes back much earlier. But the real movement that Salafis, those who identify themselves as Salafis, and which I would call a Salafi movement, it started in the late 19th century. That's the real Salafi movement by the Afghani and Abduhu and Rashidullah and those people. Before that, it was much more a Wahhabi movement. Before Wahhabi movement, it was more Hanbali movement. So if we can call it a movement, but it was not really a Salafi, a self-identified Salafi movement before that.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you make a distinction between Wahhabism, Salafism, and
yes,
Hanbali school? How would you differentiate them?
Well, I differentiate them in a way that those people before Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, they were following Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Even after him, they were following Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab introduced some new elements, or in other words, like any other traditional movement, he focused on specific parts of the Islamic understanding. So his understanding became a Wahhabi understanding of Hanbalism. Later on, when this Wahhabi understanding became kind of mixed with political and jihadi understandings, so it became a Salafi political or jihadi or modernist thought. So they are in a way different from each other. I can explain this more perhaps if...
Yeah, but isn't it the goal of every pious Muslim to follow the Salaf of the Prophet and the early pious predecessors?
Definitely, and almost all the traditionalists, they would tell you that they are following the Salafs. They don't call themselves as Salafis, but they would say that we are following the Salafis as a practice. For example, the 4 law schools, what exactly they are doing? They are following scholars from the early times. Now, what exactly are Salaf? Of course, there are different interpretations, but mostly, most of the scholars would say that the first 3 generations after the Prophet, they are the ones who are the Salaf. And for example, Abu Hanifa is one of those generations. So the people who are following him are actually following the early 3 generation, or in other words, they are following the Salaf. So if you ask them, they will tell you that we are also following the Salafis. And as I mentioned before, the Salafis themselves, their understanding of Salaf is actually kind of a little bit paradoxical, because they are not following those who were in early times. Of course, they have their own understanding of things, but generally speaking, the following the Salaf is much more is making much more sense when we talk about it in relation to the traditionalists than in relation to the Salafis.
Now, how would you explain the rise of Neo-Salafism among 2nd and 3rd generation migrants in Europe?
Basically, the Salafism is, as I said, is a byproduct of the modern challenges. In Europe also, you have those modern challenges. So the Salafism makes much more sense, because you are much more open to interpret things.
But why didn't we see much more Salafism among the 1st generation of Muslim migrants in the 1950s?
Because those people normally came from the traditional societies. In traditional societies, normally you don't need Salafism. I mean, mostly if you, the people who are Salafis in the 19th and early 20th century, they are the educated class. I mean, most of them were highly educated, and because of this, they knew about the modern challenges. If you know about the modern challenges, then this, as I mentioned before, this traditional understanding limits your interpretation, and it becomes very difficult to face the modern challenges. So those people who come in contact with the modern challenges, they normally adopt Salafis, because it's much more suitable for them or give them much more space to interpret Islam.
But then how would you explain the rise of Salafism in post-communist Balkans or in Central Asia, where the Islamic tradition is deeply entrenched?
Normally, for example, when a new situation arises, when new challenges arises, normally the Muslims or the scholars, they feel it much more comfortable to handle those challenges with Salafism as compared to handling those challenges with traditionalism. because as I mentioned, traditionalism doesn't give you much more space. Abu Hanifa has already interpreted things. So for example, if Abu Hanifa says that slavery is allowed, or for example, hijab is necessary, or whatever interpretation there are, and those interpretations you don't agree with because of the modernity, different challenges that you face, so then you feel the need to reinterpret all these different texts by yourself in the face of these modern challenges. So one can explain it normally with this kind of understanding, all these different movements that come up in different parts of the Muslim world.
Right. Professor Rehman, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much to you as well, and to Al Jazeera, and it was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Stav muslimanskih intelektualaca jeste da su muslimanskim zemljama najpotrebnije društvene, ekonomske i političke reforme. A kad je riječ o reformama Islama, inicijative moraju doći od muslimanskih učenjaka i intelektualaca, jer jedino tako mogu naići na razumijevanje i prihvatanje među muslimanima širom svijeta. Bilo je to sve u ovom specijalnom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka iz Erfurta. Cijelu emisiju možete pogledati na našoj internetskoj stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.